Thank you so much to Nash and to all the organizers. This has been a fabulous weekend and a great conference. So I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this. So I'm going to be talking to you today about acoustic social worlds, and I'm going to tell a story from Markov blankets to interpersonal synergies. And before I get started, I want to lay out a little bit of a roadmap of my talk. Hats off to the Active Inference Lab for always having great roadmaps for your presentation. That's where I'm getting this name from. So the first thing we're going to visit today is this notion of acoustic social worlds. And what is the relevance of acoustic social worlds for studying coordination in multi-agent human interaction? Then I'm going to walk through some of the ways that active inference and the notion of nested Markov blankets might be used to describe the boundaries of multi-agent systems. We're going to run into a little bit of a roadblock at this point, though, because there are questions that I'm not sure active inference and Markov blanket formalisms provide the right answers to. So that's going to take us on a little bit of a turn towards dynamical systems theory, the notion of interpersonal synergies, and the analysis tools that come along with these concepts. And we're going to end our journey today with a look at some empirical data from two different types of multi-agent systems, which interact through their own acoustic social worlds. So I hope to justify to you today the strength of dynamical systems theories and nonlinear analyses tools, such as phase-based reconstruction and recurrence quantification analysis, while also probing what kind of questions can be answered by appeal to these dynamical systems analyses versus mathematical formalizations like the free energy principle, active inference, and Markov blanket formalism. So I just want you to start by imagining the sounds of a crowded coffee shop. Consider how individuals in that coffee shop might be interacting with each other. There might be some small groups or pairs, and maybe many individuals engaging in small temporary interactions. But these individuals are not coordinating with every other individual in a cohesive coffee shop group. They're just a jumble of individuals cohabiting a shared space. Now, imagine an audience on the floor of a rock concert. They're cheering or singing along with the artists on the stage. Or alternatively, imagine the fan section at your favorite sporting event, emerging into synchronous chant or a chorus of resounding boos. Imagine how individuals in those large crowds might be interacting with each other. As they cheer or sing, chant, or boo, they're sharing similar behavioral states, engaging in similar actions. They're likely sharing similar physiological and neural states as well. These crowds are changing together in time. They're behaving, they're coordinating like one large interdependent group. These shared acoustic spaces, I'm calling them, include various levels of interaction between dyads or larger and larger groups. And the acoustic signal that's generated by these crowds carries some information about the behavioral dynamics employed in creating that signal. The sound the crowd makes carries some information about the status of that crowd as either an incidental collection of coffee goers or an integrated, coordinated crowd, like a group of concert goers. So active inference here, we've heard a lot about over the past few days. It's the process by which an organism actively changes the world so as to reduce prediction error. Active inference is also the process that organisms use to resist the second law of thermodynamics, to stay alive and not to dissipate into the environment. Organisms, living systems, use active inference in order to enforce a boundary between the organism and the environment. And we call this statistical boundary between internal states of an organism and external states in the environment a Markov blanket. I want to discuss now a few papers that got me really excited about the potential for applying this Markov blanket formalism to the dynamics of multi-agent behavior in crowds, to this transition from something like an uncoordinated incidental crowd into an integrated and coordinated interdependent group. So we're gonna have another imagination session real quick. If you just consider the initiation of a slow clap by one person, then two, then four people, before breaking into a full audience applause. Or if you consider the first musician in a flash mob who's initiating a flow of musicians and audience members towards engaging in shared music making. In these instances, as the first members of the audience start clapping or the first two musicians begin playing, you can begin to define a Markov blanket around their interaction. The others who aren't yet playing, who aren't yet clapping, who aren't participating in this interaction yet, are not yet part of this multi-agent organism. Their functions are still statistically independent from those who are operating currently under this shared Markov blanket. As you add more individuals clapping or more musicians playing, that small Markov blanket expands. Individuals who were previously part of the environment are now a part of this larger Markov blanketed system. But perhaps if we're thinking of our flash mob, the first two musicians who started this flash mob, maybe they both played the violin. And the next two musicians who joined, they're cellists, they play the cello. The local movement patterns and musical lines of the violinists are much quicker paced than the larger and slower movements and musical lines of the cellists. So the Markov blankets around each dyad remain, and they're each nested in this larger Markov blanket around this quartet of musicians, this larger Markov blanket that's constraining the behavior of the entire group. So that notion here of nested Markov blankets is spelled out in Kirchhoff et al. 2018. And what you see here in this diagram is a system that is separated from its environment via a Markov blanket. This blanket consists of sensory states that are affected by but do not influence the environment, and active states that are affected by but do not influence the internal states of the organism. And that system is made up of a multi-scale hierarchical assembly of Markov blankets, which constrain dynamics at slower global timescales and at faster local timescales. Okay, cool. So far I've just conceptually described a system, and I've identified some interesting parallels with a description of Markov blankets of Markov blankets. But there are still a few issues that bug me. Can we really call an audience or a musical ensemble, a multi-agent group of people, a living system? Their Markov boundaries are much more transient, say, than the Markov blanket around the skin of my body. And I was thrown by a statement that Kate Nave mentioned in her talk from Friston's 2013 Life as We Know It paper, that a candle flame cannot possess a Markov blanket because any pattern of molecular interactions is destroyed almost instantaneously by the flux of gas molecules from its surface. And this makes me wonder, do the temporary dynamics of agents in a crowd, an audience, a musical ensemble, do they make the crowd a little bit more like a candle flame? Additionally, is it an issue that each of the individuals inside of this Markov blanketed system are still biological and agential individuals? I'm still wondering about the candle issue. However, Matt Sims in his 2020 paper on how to count biological minds has alleviated some of my worries about each individual attaining some of their individualness within a superordinate crowd. So in this paper, Matt Sims has adapted the model you see on the left and the notion of multi-scale integration to accommodate symbiotic individuals using an example case of the bobtail squid and Vibrio fischeri bacteria. This new diagram of nested Markov blankets on the right has collapsed these yellow and orange active and sensory states, intermingling them, at least in this picture, into a single layer. And the idea is that while there is a superordinate Markov blanket around the entire squid plus Vibrio fischeri system, at the same time, there are Markov blankets around the squid, around the V. fischeri bacteria, which each individually play a role as sensory or active states with respect to each other. So maintaining a little bit of their individuality and functioning as part of this larger symbiotic system. So maybe a crowd can consist of Markov blankets in this way. And each member of the crowd or each dyad might play the role of an active or sensory state, coordinating internal and external dynamics relative to the superordinate group, while at the same time coordinating their own active sensory states with respect to their own internal and external dynamics. And this concept of a nested Markov blanket might seem a little more tractable if we impose it on a musical ensemble, where even the spatial organization on stage is somewhat mirroring the temporal organization of their musical output, where the drummers are going to have similar movements to the other drummers, and they're going to have similar movements to the other folks in the percussion section. And then over here, the flutes and clarinets are going to have similar movements, similar acoustic outputs that's slightly different from the trombonists and the tubas, maybe in the back. So they each have their Markov blankets surrounding their physiological states, and the similar shared acoustic output between each of these individual groups. But everyone's participating in the same global acoustic signal, so the same constraining dynamics created by the musical ensemble as a whole is affecting the behavior in each of these smaller Markov blanketed systems, and then each of the individuals there inside. Now, of course, in looking at people, looking at a crowd, there are other important factors at play when determining whether we can draw a Markov blanket around a crowd, or if we decide that a crowd is acting as one integrated multi-agent system, rather than a collection of just independent agents. These include social contexts, the development of patterned cultural practices in these different contexts, the scripts surrounding what events happen and when they happen, and the regimes of shared attention between each of these agents in these different social contexts. So I've just suggested that Markov blankets might be an interesting place to start in describing the dynamics and the emergence of integrated, interactive multi-agent groups like a crowd. But I don't work with the maths of the free energy principle, and I don't have the tools to test the hypothesis that I've just put forth. Additionally, there is more to describe than just the existence or not of a Markov blanket and the emergence or not of a crowd-level individual. So I have questions. Can we measure the behavior or the emergence of Markov blankets as they expand and contract over time? Also, how does a group of people move between novel and habitual patterns of coordination? How does a multi-agent system navigate and transitions between chaos and stability? So here's where we take a slight turn. And for these questions, I have found tools under dynamical systems theory and with the concept of interpersonal synergies. So the concept of synergies first, it arises from the literature on motor control as a solution to the degrees of freedom problem. So essentially, Bernstein noted that fine and precise control of every degree of freedom in a motor movement would be computationally intractable for the nervous system to solve. So instead, muscles self-organized into coupled and locally constrained degrees of freedom. They form temporary soft assemblies of motor function that can enable flexible movement and coordination. So this definition of a synergy I thought was pretty great and kind of easy to digest from Fusaroli et al. In 2014. And this definition, I'll read it for you. Synergies are defined by three things: their functional specificity, dimensional compression, and reciprocal compensation. So the need to perform a function or functional specificity temporarily shapes the coordination of several components into one system. This is dimensional compression, in which external and internal perturbations are flexibly dealt with via compensatory adjustments of the components. This is reciprocal compensation, in order to preserve the functionality of the whole system for as long as is needed. So we can differentiate mere coordination as a result of engaging with the same stimulus and then similar action patterns from a true interpersonal synergy, which results as microscale structures of a system interact to give rise to macroscale dynamics. So when a synergy develops, we no longer need to describe the independent dynamics of each microscale structure. We can instead describe the behavior of a single interaction dominant system, which consists of complementary actions from each person's motor activity as it pertains to their role in this softly assembled complex system. You might even notice by looking at these graphics that there's a certain similarity between the notion of a Markov blanket and of a synergy. These might very well be two sides of the same coins, two perspectives on a very similar conceptual landscape. So let's come back to some of my questions from earlier. Can we measure the behavior or emergence of Markov blankets around a small group of people extending up to a large crowd as they expand and contract over time? Similarly, can we measure the interpersonal synergies that develop, that emerge in dyads, large groups, and entire crowds? Again, how does a group of people move between novel and habitual forms of coordination? How does a multi-agent system navigate transitions between chaos and stability? And let's make it a little bit trickier. The real world is messy and measurement is difficult. In a naturalistic social interaction in a very large crowd, I probably can't measure the behavior of every single individual person. I probably can't give everyone an individual microphone. I probably can't track each person's brain states in a large crowd. And I might not even have access to a camera, let alone good motion capture cameras that can track everyone's head and limb movements. But come back now to the crowds we imagined at the start of this discussion. So the difference between the coffee shop crowd and the rock concert audience or the sporting event crowd, they're trivially easy for you or I to identify. An uncoordinated group of independent individuals happening to coexist in a shared space versus a coordinated interdependent group of members of a crowd. We can simply hear that these two groups of people sound different. Similar, we can simply hear when we are engaged in participating as a collective sort of agent, or whether we're just interacting in a large independent group of people, or even a very large musical ensemble. So with a well-placed microphone, or maybe a few microphones, we can generate a single audio recording of the sound that an interacting group makes over time. A human can make inferences about the interaction and acoustic social world of these crowds just by listening to the sounds they've created. Similarly, tools from dynamical systems and theories allows us to make inferences about the behavior of an entire complex system based on this one measurement that we have access to. So for the next little while, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of theory and a toy example, and then I'm going to end this talk with data from two different real live multi-agent groups analyzed with tools from dynamical systems theory. So the first item in our toolkit here we have is phase-based reconstruction. So we can reconstruct the behavior of a system as a whole by measuring only one of its parts, and this is called Tockin's theorem. This is accomplished by embedding delayed copies of a single time series into multiple dimensions. And what you have on the right here is a single time series extracted from the Recurrence system, delayed to make another time series and delayed once more to make a third time series. So the Recurrence system, if you know, is it's describable by three differential equations. And using the one time series we have, we can reconstruct a projection of the Recurrence system. And this phase-based reconstruction maintains the same topography as the original Recurrence system. And in the case of our acoustic crowd data, what we can take is a time series of the acoustic signal, and we can embed that into further dimensions, just like we did with the Recurrence systems. And we can follow this exact same steps to reconstruct that system's behavior over time. And once we've completed this phase-based reconstruction, we can visualize the behavior of the reconstructed system by generating what's called recurrence plots. So this is done by plotting recurrent points from the reconstructed phase space that's within some radius that we set. We can evaluate the structures in this recurrence plot via recurrence quantification analysis. So on the right here, you see a few examples of some time series. You see their reconstructed phase spaces in the middle, and on the bottom, you see the recurrence plots. So one of the simplest measures we can glean from recurrence plots are the rate that states reoccur, and this is called simply recurrence rate. So in these diagrams, on the left here, you see a time series of a simple sine wave. And of course, if you reconstruct the phase space of a sine wave, you're going to get something like a circle. We then plot a point on our recurrence plot every time our system revisits a portion of the phase space within that certain radius that we've set. In the sine wave's recurrence plot, we can see a lot of these diagonal lines. Diagonal lines reflect deterministic behavior, and they track how similar sequences of values change over time. As our sine wave is reliably deterministic, we see these long diagonals. The recurrence value we extract here is, as expected, called determinism. In the middle, we see uncorrelated white noise. The time series is random, the reconstructed phase space is similarly random, and as a result, we see little to no diagonal or any other structures in the recurrence plot. And finally, on the right, we see a time series extracted from speech. It's a little bit deterministic, like our sine wave, so there are some diagonal structures in the recurrence plot, but the length of these diagonals varies. And we report this variation in a value called entropy. Finally, recurrence plots can also contain certain vertical structures in addition to the diagonals. You don't see any here, but vertical structures occur when states do not change for some period of time. So these are indications of periods of stability, and we measure these with a value called laminarity. Laminarity, in contrast with determinism, measures how a signal is organized in terms of similar absolute values that are stable over time. And that was a lot to throw at you, so just to summarize and provide a slightly different visual, the recurrence quantification analysis measures that we take from our system our recurrence rate, which is the percentage of recurrence points on the recurrence plot. It represents patterns of behavior that repeat over time. And then determinism, the percentage of points that fall on a diagonal in the recurrence plot. And determinism represents behaviors that belong to a longer sequence of behavior. Entropy, the variability in the lengths of these diagonal lines, represents the amount of disorder that there is in these sequence. And finally, laminarity, this is the percentage of all points that fall on a vertical line in the recurrence plot, and this represents clusters of behavior for some length of time, such as when a system visits a behavior for a period of time, leaves, and then returns to that behavioral state. Okay, great. Thank you for going with me on that theoretical journey. And now that you know how recurrence plots are generated and how to interpret them, we're going to take a look at two types of crowds. So the first crowd I'm looking at, the first multi-agent system, is a model system for us. So this is a group of musicians. They're performing a piece called Welcome to the Imagination World. This piece was composed to do something really interesting. So the composer wrote the first few minutes of the piece to be completely random. In music theory terms, we call this aleatoric, when some element of the music is left up to chance or left up to whatever the performers decide to play in the moment. So assuming the sounds work, the start of this video sounds a little bit like this. All right, so that's not the musicians warming up on stage. It's the actual music. And here the musicians themselves are instructed not to interact with each other. After a few minutes, the musical score directs the musicians to coordinate. And they begin to sound more like one interacting ensemble. And I'll play you a little bit of what that sounds like. All right. So what we're seeing here is we have sort of a ground truth knowledge of what the system is doing. In the beginning, they're uncoordinated, independent individual musicians. And then the musical interaction, when they start interacting with each other, this serves as a coupling mechanism. And as this coordination between the musicians arises, they begin to sound like one musical ensemble. So what we aren't seeing here, we're not seeing emergent or spontaneous interaction in this particular musical composition and performance, since the musicians are told what to do a little bit by the musical score, and they're told precisely when to begin coordinating the behavior. And so in this particular performance, the divide between uncoordinated and coordinated joint music making, it's made even more apparent by the fact that the lights turn on and the conductor arrives on stage just as the musicians begin to play together as one ensemble. But it provides a really good test bed, since we have the ground truth of what the dynamics are of this two-stage of coordination patterns. We can use these recurrence quantification analysis tools from dynamical systems, and we can ask, are there any differences in the nonlinear recurrence dynamics that we measure with RQA between the uncoordinated and coordinated acoustic behavior of this musical ensemble? And yes, there are. So at the top here, you're seeing 30 seconds from the beginning of that uncoordinated jumble of sounds, the end of that uncoordinated jumble of sounds, and at the bottom are the first and last 30 seconds of the coordinated part of the piece where they sound like a musical ensemble. And we can see that the acoustic behavior for musicians in the coordinated section of the music is much more structured with these vertical bursts of collected stretches of sound. We can even look closer at 5-second samples. So if I look at 5 seconds out of each of these 30-second sections, we see the same sort of vertical structures emerging in the coordinated sections, but not the uncoordinated sections. And we can perhaps learn even a little bit more by looking at the distributions of those measures that we extract from these plots. So in this plot here, what you're seeing is the coordinated section of the piece in blue and uncoordinated sections in red. So what we're seeing for each of these RQA metrics is that when the musicians began interacting with each other as a coordinated musical ensemble, recurrence and stability measures increased overall. In addition, the interacting ensemble also exhibited further variability in these recurrence measures. This indicates that the interacting ensemble of musicians were able to explore a greater variety of behavior than when they performed as a stage full of individual musicians. We can see this even more clearly if we plot those same recurrence measures over time. So the blue and purple lines here represent the uncoordinated initial sections of the piece, and orange and greens are from the coordinated section of the piece. And you can see when they're coordinated, these values are much more I've said this backward. Orange and green are from the uncoordinated section of the piece. Blue and purple are from the coordinated section of the piece. And you can see a lot more variability when they're allowed to coordinate with each other. All right, so that's cool. That's a musical ensemble. But what about an even messier data? Well, I have some data from the cheering section, the student section of a basketball game. And we can ask, is there a relationship between these nonlinear recurrence dynamics measured by RQA and different categories of acoustic behavior of this crowd at a basketball game? And this data, it was labeled by undergraduates. It's from colleagues at BYU. And it was labeled into a few different kinds of behavior. There was positive chanting, distraction noise, angry noise, a few other categories of behavior. I'm just going to show you recurrence plots from 2 of these. So the first you see here is a recurrence plot of distraction noise. And you could think of this as booing or, I don't know, jangling keys or something at someone throwing a free throw, trying to distract them. And you can see there's not a lot of features in this recurrence plot. It looks a lot like our uncoordinated section of that musical piece. In contrast, the second recurrence plot here is from a section where the fans were positively chanting, go team, go, whatever you chant at a basketball game. And you see here clearly these vertical bursts of laminar activity. You see periods of stability in this crowd as they're interacting together, as they're making this chant. And I can plot this out in distributions as well. So these are our 4 different RQA metrics. And you can see a difference between, these are 6 kinds of sounds that our basketball crowd was making. Positive chant at the top, negative chanting, distraction noise, cheer, applause, and anger. And you can see differences in these. You can also see similarities. So maybe positive and negative chant are pretty similar to each other. They seem to revisit states frequently, which is that recurrence measure, which makes sense if you think of the periodicity of a chant. They're also both following a fairly stable variety of long trajectories of states, and they're tending to revisit states in a similar way. And positive and negative chant are also quite different from the other categories of crowd sound. Distraction, noise, cheer, and applause, they all look pretty similar here to me. A bit lower on these RQA metrics, while angry noise seems to be off by itself with low RQA metrics across the board. And then if we sort of test this question, this is just a plot of estimated marginal means where I've done pairwise comparisons between these different RQA metrics. And you're seeing a graphical representation here of how similar those pairwise comparisons say each of these sounds are to each other. And you can see positive and negative chant are pretty consistently over here. They don't quite overlap, but distraction, noise, cheer, and applause, especially here in this determinism category, they have similar deterministic states, deterministic measurements. And we could talk more about this, but I think I've run out of time. So I'll just conclude here by saying that Markov blankets might be interesting. They might be an interesting way to categorize or to describe how nested behavior within crowds can expand and contract to have different boundaries around a crowd. But the tools from dynamical systems analyses, such as face-based reconstruction, RQA, really do have a lot to tell us about the information about the difference in these two kinds of dynamics. And I would love to have a conversation after this in the Q&A about how well you think we could apply this Markov blanket formalism to crowds, if maybe looking at interpersonal synergies is the better way to go. And before we end, I just want to thank my collaborators who work with me on this project. Marley Reeves is a PhD candidate in the Applied Mathematics Department at UC Merced. Chris Kello and Michael Spivey have worked on each of these projects with us, and my advisor, Ramesh Balasubramaniam. So thank you all for attending my talk. You can find me on email, Twitter, if you want to know anything about UC Merced or my lab at UC Merced. There are links, and I look forward to chatting in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Shannon, for the wonderful talk. We will take questions now. If anybody would like to come to the Q&A, Mao.
Hey, Shannon, it was really quite a brilliant talk. I guess my question is, it's interesting that you went through this from a sound perspective, because in effect, that's what we believe, that's what we consider sound to be, right? It's the main way through which we are capable of coordinating, because that's how information travels. How would you see this sort of pattern being extended towards elements which don't necessarily produce sound? Like how would you see this, these patterns being analyzed outside the sound system?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. There's actually been a lot of research using recurrence quantification analysis and this development of interpersonal synergies using motion capture data. So other things that coordinate, the sound coordinates, and it's great because we can hear that result of our coordination in a certain way. But if we're in conversation with someone and we're chatting, whether we can see them or not, there are subtle patterns in postural fluctuations. So these postural mechanisms that we're not aware of that keep us balanced, they'll start maybe mirroring each other or coordinating in certain structured ways just through a conversation. And you can analyze that through this motion capture data in quite a similar way that I did with the sound.
Yeah, that's that's exactly what we're positing with the scripts, right? It's that you're sending a series of signals that are codified to enable this coordination should you desire it, or in fact, because it makes it smoother for society to just continue existing within its set of states. So then the next, I mean, unless someone else has a question, but my next question would be jazz. I mean, jazz. The reason that jazz doesn't make everybody happy, I believe, like a lot of people are kind of ambivalent about it, is because of the difficulty for people to coordinate with the music, right? Like you, as a person listening to it, are having a hard time predicting where it's going, and thus it doesn't create this sort of flowy pleasure for a lot of people. However, the whole point of jazz is that the musicians together are coordinating, and they literally do not even need a sheet in order to be able to coordinate, because they understand the patterns that are going on. And so this here is maybe where I'm having a hard time understanding how some effects of really accurate coordination create such a boundary that becomes practically impenetrable by people, practically because some people do like jazz, but impenetrable by others who are witnessing this and trying to coordinate.
Yeah, so I think this goes into, I think it fits very well with your notion of scripts and the idea that we learn these scripts for different situations. So it could be jazz for some people, it could be heavy metal music for some other people. Maybe this just sounds awful, I don't like dancing to it, I don't like coordinating to it, how can you listen to this? But after you start, maybe you join a jazz band to learn more about it, and you start learning the patterns, learning what kind of interactions are appropriate, where they're appropriate. You start learning the history, so you start learning which of the jazz greats someone is calling when they're improvising on a certain line. Or you start to actually recognize the different harmonies that are actually present in this loud heavy metal music, and you start to befriend people who are knowledgeable about these two musical systems. You start to learn more about these musical systems. You engage more in listening or in performing or in dancing, what have you, to these systems. And the more you engage, the more you learn. The scripts start to help organize your participation in this greater sort of social system and allow you to be able to integrate with that music or with people making that music.
Hi, Shannon. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed that. I was just really curious, this use of recurrence plots, I think it's really interesting, and it seems to obviously gives you options to open into other dynamical systems approaches and stuff. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on like how you really came to expand into that, and how much potential you think recurrence plots and the use of this can have for others in their work.
Yeah, well, they're not, none of this is particularly new. So that first look at Bernstein was in like 1970 something, when he was looking at people hammering and how they didn't move to exactly the same point. They didn't move through exactly the same trajectory. And the use of recurrence quantification analysis has been applied to more than just systems of motor control. And it doesn't just apply to living systems either. So you can look at the trajectory of, any complex system. I'm thinking of a hurricane over time, and you can identify different trajectories in that underlying behavior. And pretty much anything that you can turn into a time series, you can analyze using these recurrence quantification analysis tools and plot in a recurrence plot. So I think it has a similar usefulness to this notion of the free energy principle being this like multi-scale principle where you can talk about the dynamics of cells all the way to the dynamics of city-states. Similarly, you can use this as an empirical measurement tool to compare the trajectories of a slime mold through space or the trajectories of a crowd navigating through a city or something like that. I think they're equally broad and applicable. And for me personally, I think these dynamical systems tools are a little bit more transparent and accessible than the mathematics that underlies a lot of the free energy principle and the Markov blanket formalism, in the sense, and it could just be because I'm coming from sort of an experimental background. So if anything that can help me analyze my experimental data, I love it. If it helps me model my data, I need someone else to help me do the modeling.
And do you think that there's a bit like, are you looking for like some mathematical way to track correlation, or can you sort of eyeball it, so to speak? You know, like you could see the patterns. So there's a sort of qualitative potential, I suppose, but are you looking for other quantitative ways to say, I mean, I suppose you can clearly see something's different, so it's fairly clear there's a different pattern. But I just wondered, like, how to say you've got a correlation, or say you've got a difference that's meaningful.
Yeah, so you've touched on something there. So the recurrence plots, they give us that sort of qualitative, the gist of what the data looks like, because I can see that these two plots look different. And then the metrics that we get through recurrence quantification analysis are giving that numerical description of what we're seeing in the plots. And what was the next part of your question? Are you looking for?
Yeah, like, is there like a quantitative way, or some sort of like, I don't know, some sort of way that you could get a measure that would say how much it's like this or like that?
Oh, maybe like you mean how much like crowd A is like crowd B?
Yeah, or a correlation between laminatory or entropy patterns or something.
Yeah, so you can look at the way these time series are generated when I'm looking at a musical output or at a crowd output, is you're looking at like windowed time slices, and that's how you're getting these different recurrence measures over time. And then when I'm plotting those distributions, it's how recurrent that system was throughout this long section of time that I've put into little windows here. And I can look at, kind of do your regular, you know, statistical analyses, whether you're using Bayesian methods or whether you're using null hypothesis significance testing, and, you know, just comparing, just like you would with any other. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Take care.
I don't know if there's time for my question, because I think the next talk is at 10:45. Can I ask, or I can also...
If the organizers don't object, I can try to answer real quick.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. It was really interesting and really useful for me. I was wondering, the kind of examples that you studied were examples of interpersonal coordination, where there's kind of rhythms that are common to the people interacting. So there's kind of a similarity in behavior that is entrained in the interaction. And I was wondering if you wanted to study and add idea on how to study interactions where there's a coordination around complementary behavior, which is organized in function of the goals of a joint action. So I don't know if you have ideas about that, and how you could measure the kind of coordination that emerges when people are trying to do something together and they don't adopt similar behavior that is, for instance, in the same rhythm, but that they interact with each other in ways that are complementary and help us reach common goals. I don't know if you have ideas on this topic.
Yeah, so that one quote that I gave you from Riccardo Fusilleri is from a paper called Dialogue as Interpersonal Synergy. And so dialogue, it's kind of, I say an easy case, not that dialogue is easy, but it's a point where I'm not speaking exactly at the same time that you're speaking. I might not even be using the same rhythms in my speech patterns as you are, but together this turn-taking dynamic is forming this complementary process, like you say, and we're using that. So that's forming this functional interpersonal synergy with each other. And I think that's a great place to start. It's called Dialogue as Interpersonal Synergy from Fusaroli et al. In 2014. And there's a lot more. You can look at the dynamics of sports teams. So soccer players aren't doing the same thing as other people on their team, but they're coordinating literally towards this shared goal. And you can look at that in terms of functional synergies in the same way.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.